So like, I would think, you and me, we wouldn't sacrifice our kids, but how do you deal with that and moral objectivity?
Right. Very, very good question. And I've dealt with this on my website, reasonablefaith.org. I think question of the week number 16 deals with the question of these commands that God gives to certain Old Testament figures that seem to imply that they should do something that we would regard as immoral, like Abraham should sacrifice his son Isaac. And I think that the moral theory that I've offered tonight makes good sense of those commands. Because what I said is that our moral duties are constituted by God's commandments. And so I think that God has the ability to command someone to do something which becomes his moral duty, but which in the absence of a divine command would be wrong for him to do. So it's not as though God could command Abraham to murder someone, but he could command Abraham to do something which in the absence of a divine command would otherwise be murder. And what one would say is that God has morally sufficient reasons for issuing such an extraordinary command. Namely, it's to test Abraham's faith, and when he sees Abraham's faith, then he rescinds the command and says, don't do it, don't sacrifice Isaac. What this doesn't imply is that it could be a general moral principle that people ought to kill their children. I don't think that's possible. The case of Abraham and Isaac is the exception that proves the rule. But that since God's commandments are the source of our duties, I think he could make exceptions like that in certain cases to command something that in the absence of a command we would say would be wrong.
Hello. Okay, so I agree with the first half of the presentation that God is what roots our moral duties if he exists. But I don't agree that if God didn't exist, there wouldn't be any true moral propositions. And it's because of something you said on your website, actually, as long as we're talking about your website. Someone asked if God could have reasons for his commands. And you said yes. You said God can have reasons for why he commands what he does, such as be kind and generous and love one another. But if that's true, then I don't see any reason why God, being the one who possesses those reasons, is at all important. Because if God didn't exist, people could possess the exact same reasons that God did for commanding certain things, and they would, those moral truths would still hold. Because for something to be a reason, it has to be an objective reason. Otherwise, God's commands would just be arbitrary, and there's no reason to do something that's arbitrary. So I think that, that if God has reasons, that means it doesn't matter that he's the one that has them, because there's no such thing as a subjective reason. A reason is inherently something that applies to multiple people.
There are contingent reasons, though, and I don't remember the context of the remark on the website, unfortunately, but for example, take the Sabbath command that God gives in the Ten Commandments to honor the Sabbath. I think we could say God has a reason for commanding that, namely he wants to have Israel reflect certain duties to God that would involve worshiping him, but eventually he abolishes the Sabbath command when Christ comes, and Sunday, the Lord's Day, replaces the Sabbath. The Sunday is not the Sabbath. That command is abrogated. So God had reasons for giving this command, but in the absence of God, I don't see that there'd be any reason to keep the Sabbath. I mean, it just wouldn't make sense at all. So that was what I meant by reasons. Or think of the food laws and other sorts of laws in the Old Testament that God gave. He had reasons for giving these rules and regulations to ancient Israel, but it wasn't as though those things were independent of God or were forever. He eventually abolished many of those, but they served their purpose temporarily. So that's what I meant. But I don't think that there is some sort of a moral reason why, for example, kindness is good that goes beyond God. Once you get to God, it seems to me you've reached the ultimate stopping point. And in the absence of God, I don't see any reason to think that what we call kindness among this primate species would have any sort of moral properties at all. any more than it does in a troop of baboons. It seems to me it's just the result of sociobiological conditioning.
But doesn't that mean God's command to be kind is arbitrary?
It doesn't make them arbitrary because they reflect his nature. Remember, there are two types of divine command theory, as you probably know. There is a kind of voluntarism that was exemplified, for example, by William Ockham, a medieval theologian. And Ockham, oh, did my mic go out?
Yep.
Oh, brother. Boy, we've really had trouble with these mics. Now, it doesn't sound like this one is on.
Yes,
is it? It is on, okay. William of Ockham had a voluntarist view of God's commands. He thought that God just arbitrarily makes up commands, and these become our moral duties. But that wasn't the majority position for divine command theorists. Most thought that the commandments are a necessary expression of God's nature. And what Plato called the good, Christian theologians just made the nature of God, the moral character of God. So the commands aren't arbitrary. God couldn't have willed that we fall down and worship some other God before him. This is an essential reflection of his nature.
I had